Nintendo, the company people love to love, love to hate, and hate to love. Yeah, there's a lot of different ways people feel about Nintendo, something that just naturally comes with the territory of being such a high-profile company. You don't see a tornado of emotions when it comes to a company like, say, Sunsoft. It's typically just, oh yeah, they made some nice games for the NES. Sometimes I feel like Nintendo's own fans hate them more than the people who just hate Nintendo with no strings attached. The straight up haters might be content to just type Mario sucks in all caps somewhere online every few days, and they're good to go. The fans tend to be more invested, and that usually has to do with expectations more than anything. There's nothing more dangerous than somebody being excited for something just to have that excitement obstructed. Just ask this box of cheesy crackers that didn't want to open up for me. When it comes to people's feelings about Nintendo, by the way, take a drink every time I say Nintendo, my suggestion would be water, I find you can often categorize things as how people feel about Nintendo's games and how people feel about Nintendo's business practices, which inevitably cross paths. Perfect example for you would be the NES Classic Edition. There was far more demand than supply, to which Nintendo seemed genuinely surprised, like, oh, you all actually want these things? Are you sure? Some people were so pissed off about that, they even accused Nintendo of intentionally limiting supply, something they've certainly been accused of for other things as well. For people who love Nintendo's IPs and games but hate their business practices, a lot of times it boils down to wanting certain games re-released, or a sequel to be put into development for a franchise that's been dormant for years. Yeah, you can count on Mario games being released regularly, but how can a series like F-Zero go so many years in between games? And needless to say, showing up in Smash Bros. Isn't enough for most fans. As far as having Nintendo's back catalog of games available to play, they've certainly tried different things, and the offering that seemed to make the most people happy was probably the Wii's Virtual Console, which ironically had its servers shut down. Score. I think there's a lot of people who like something Nintendo did, but not everything they've done. And because Nintendo is known for trying different things, a lot of people have expectations that get crushed when Nintendo chooses to go in a different direction. I thought a journey through some of Nintendo's consoles could be a fun way to explore this. First up, we've got the NES. Not a lot of expectations here, especially in the US where the video game market wasn't doing so hot. Simply existing was almost a win here, although they certainly had to change the perception around video games in the US. Plenty of good games from both Nintendo and other third parties were looking pretty good. For Nintendo's next console, all they gotta do here is make the Nintendo again, but just a little better. Sure, that'll work too. Again, Nintendo is still making good games themselves, as well as plenty of good games being made by third-party developers. Things are still looking pretty good. So what comes next? It's gotta be the super-duper Nintendo, right? Wrong. It's the Nintendo 64, named as such for its 64 reasons it would piss people off. This is where Nintendo really threw some curveballs. The controller was unconventional, they stuck with cartridges, and the third-party support was just not there like it was for their previous consoles. And yet, it still had some games some people consider to be the greatest of all time. That sounds like a positive thing, right? The thing with Nintendo is that even while they're disappointing people, they're often still delighting people, and sometimes it's the very same people. You can be guaranteed there were fans of the N64 who were devastated that Final Fantasy never came to the console. And take a look at the Wii U. As much as I, as well as many other Nintendo fans, wanted more from it, I don't know if I can tell you a time I laughed harder with friends than playing Nintendo Land. Alright, so what came after the Nintendo 64? The Nintendo GameCube. Finally, the cube shape would get its chance in the video game world. This is where things get interesting, because this is probably the best example of a Nintendo console that is more popular now than it was when it was current. Sure, the GameCube was around back then, and there were people who liked it. I had one, but its reputation wasn't nearly what it is now. People liked to make fun of it back then, calling it things such as the purple lunchbox and bad. But I always thought it was pretty cool back then, and what do people have against purple lunchboxes? So what if it's got a handle? GameCube on the go, baby, who could say no? Then there was the Wii, which came pretty hot out of the gate. The motion controls were initially pretty trendy. It had the Wii Virtual Console people love so much, it could even play GameCube games, but no handles, sadly. Well, whatever, where there's a will, there's a way. However, as that generation went on, more and more people began to criticize the Wii for features that it was lacking, such as no HD functionality, it couldn't play movie discs, but perhaps biggest of all, a lot of big releases for PS3 and 360 were just nowhere to be found, and compromised if they were. Then we got the Wii U. People were sick of the Wii remotes by that point, so how about a giant tablet? Fans were glad to finally have Nintendo games in HD, but many people wanted more. I actually thought Wii U was a university Nintendo was planning to start when they first announced the name. Sounded like a fun place. The Wii U could be played within range of the console, but not out of range, which kind of bummed people out. So for Nintendo's next console, they released the Switch, which was no longer tethered to anything. And like magic, suddenly the games that lots of people ignored on the Wii U years earlier started to sell far better. The power of marketing. And the power of a fanbase feeling like they're being given what they want. In the case of the Switch, it was something a lot of people didn't know they wanted, which I'd argue can often be more satisfying than getting something you know you did want. And it seems like Nintendo is always trying to do this. Give us something we didn't know we wanted. Sometimes we didn't know we wanted it until years later. That can happen in life, like your parents teaching you as a child to behave and be polite. It turns out people don't like jerks. Good call, Mom and Dad. Problem is, when you try to give somebody something they didn't know they wanted, it can end up being something that you didn't know they didn't want, and then you kind of look like a fool. It's a risk, and typically companies as large as Nintendo don't take risks because so much is at stake. I've always appreciated that about them, especially since everyone else making gaming hardware tend to play it safe, and only try something wacky if Nintendo already tried that wacky thing and it worked. Oh, and how could I not mention handhelds? Well, by not mentioning handhelds, I suppose, but I want to talk about them because they're such a big part of Nintendo's identity. Some people would even say that Nintendo's handheld line has been what always kept them afloat through some of the rough patches they had with home consoles. Nintendo's famous Game Boy line is practically synonymous with popularizing handheld gaming. Next, the DS line came and said, okay, how about I sell more units than darn near any system ever? The 3DS didn't do as well, but still great numbers overall. And finally, Nintendo just said, screw it, let's just turn our home consoles into our handhelds, since their success is so much more reliable. But when it comes to Nintendo as a business, some of the biggest criticism that I see comes from how people feel they treat their fans, taking down fan projects as well as other stuff that's somehow rooted in protecting their intellectual property. As far as that goes, I don't really know enough about what it takes to run a giant Japanese business to give much of an opinion on what they should be doing, but my guess would be that they're not doing it to be mean. Are they overzealous with it sometimes? I don't know, but the point remains either way that fans feel burned, and that's unfortunate. When it comes to whether or not Nintendo has been a good company or a bad company, of course everyone's opinion will vary, but personally I'd say it's a mix of both, though mostly good overall. I mean, my lifetime of gaming wouldn't be anything near what it's been without them, as I'm sure is the case for many other gamers as well. But being the huge company they are, they're bound to make mistakes, even if some of them seem like they were easier to avoid than others, and people are entitled to criticize them for those. But people who want Nintendo to be gone or out of the hardware race, I'm not on board with that. They're the only video game company left with a long history of making both consoles and games themselves. There's a certain novelty to that. And yeah, I wish Sega was still making consoles too. Plus, I can't think of anything I like that I couldn't make at least some criticism of. Oh, you know what? Actually, never mind. But with all of that said, I do want to hear what you all have to say about Nintendo, and I don't know about you, but I really have to go to the bathroom. I think I'm mostly curious about answers that have a mixed opinion, but of course I still want to hear all other answers as well. So for that and anything else you'd like to say, leave a comment down below, and I will see ya in the next video.
He's the Retro Bird, yeah, and he's talking about me.